In the early hours following the devastating Japanese Imperial Army attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the war in the Pacific Ocean exploded into simultaneous action across thousands of miles. As part of this sweeping offensive, the Japanese High Command targeted a series of remote, isolated United States Army outposts. None was more exposed than Wake Island, a tiny, boomerang-shaped atoll located centrally in the Pacific Ocean. The island served as a crucial refueling stop for military aircraft and was deemed vital by the United States Navy for monitoring Japanese movements, but its location left it dangerously isolated, thousands of miles from any substantial Allied support. The garrison tasked with defending this remote outpost was an unconventional mix of soldiers and civilian workers. The primary defensive force consisted of approximately 450 highly trained men from the United States Marine Corps, equipped with coastal defense guns and anti-aircraft artillery. This military contingent was vastly outnumbered by over 1,100 civilian contractors, mostly employees of the Morrison-Knudsen Company, who were hurriedly working to construct a vital naval air base and infrastructure. The military commander, Major James Devereux, faced the immense and immediate task of preparing this combined, civilian-heavy population for the inevitable, brutal assault by the Japanese Imperial Army. The Japanese attack began almost immediately. On the morning of December 8, 1941, mere hours after the strike on Pearl Harbor, and before the garrison had even confirmed the full scope of the war, devastating Japanese air raids struck Wake Island. The first wave of bombers surprised the defenders, quickly destroying 8 of the 12 aging United States Marine Corps fighter aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. This initial, crippling loss meant the small garrison was effectively blind and without any aerial defense, leaving them fully exposed to the daily, relentless bombing runs that would follow. Despite the immediate, crippling aerial losses and the demoralizing realization of their complete isolation, the United States Marine Corps Command and the vast majority of the civilian contractors refused to consider surrender. They knew that no reinforcements could possibly reach them in time, but the Marines began feverishly fortifying the beaches, preparing to fight a desperate, prolonged siege. The stage was set for one of the most heroic, yet costly, last stands of the entire Pacific War, a battle driven by sheer defiance against overwhelming numerical and material superiority. The days immediately following the initial Japanese Imperial Army air raids on Wake Island were a period of desperate preparation and hardening of defenses. Despite the loss of their crucial air cover, the United States Marine Corps defenders, under the resolute command of Major James Devereux, worked tirelessly to establish a defensive perimeter. They repurposed civilian construction equipment, created makeshift bunkers, and dug extensive trench lines, transforming the remote atoll into a desperate fortress. The civilian contractors, far from being a liability, displayed incredible courage, assisting with fortification, medical care, and supply distribution, proving their invaluable contribution to the besieged garrison. The first major Japanese Imperial Army naval invasion attempt came on the morning of December 11, 1941. A powerful invasion fleet, consisting of 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 2 transport ships carrying a full landing force, approached Wake Island with immense confidence. The Japanese commanders expected a swift, overwhelming victory, anticipating little effective resistance from the small, isolated garrison. The sheer audacity of challenging such a powerful naval force with limited land-based defenses was unprecedented and would soon stun the entire Pacific Ocean theater of war. However, the United States Marine Corps defenders, despite their numerical inferiority, were anything but passive. They allowed the Japanese Imperial Navy fleet to approach within range of their hidden, antiquated coastal defense guns. At the precise moment, Major Devereux gave the order to open fire. The Marines coordinated, Accurate salvos struck the Japanese ships with devastating effect, sinking the destroyer Hate with a direct hit to its magazine and heavily damaging several other vessels, including a cruiser. This unexpected and fierce resistance immediately forced the entire Japanese invasion fleet to retreat. The repulsion of the first Japanese Imperial Army naval invasion was an astonishing and unprecedented victory. It marked the first time in World War II that a surface invasion force had been repelled by shore-based defenses alone. The news of the Japanese Imperial Navy's humiliating defeat at Wake Island provided a desperately needed morale boost for the United States and the Allied nations, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor. It transformed the tiny outpost into a symbol of unwavering defiance, a beacon of hope in the darkest days of the early Pacific War. Following the humiliating repulsion of the first naval assault, the Japanese Imperial Army did not relent. Instead, they intensified their aerial bombardment of Wake Island. Day after day, waves of Japanese bombers relentlessly pounded the tiny atoll, systematically destroying its remaining infrastructure and attempting to break the morale of the defenders. The United States Marine Corps garrison, despite their desperate situation, continued to fight back with fierce determination, using their anti-aircraft guns to contest the skies. Their tenacity in the face of overwhelming air superiority became legendary, forcing the Japanese pilots to fly higher and drop bombs less accurately. Despite the initial destruction of most of their aircraft, a small, highly courageous group of United States Marine Corps pilots, flying the few remaining F-4F Wildcat fighters, managed to provide sporadic but vital aerial defense. These few pilots, flying against overwhelming odds, launched daring intercept missions, shooting down several Japanese bombers and even sinking a submarine. Their incredible bravery and skill, in the face of no reinforcement or resupply, gave the defenders a glimmer of hope and further frustrated the Japanese high command, who expected total air superiority. The Japanese Imperial Navy also established a continuous submarine patrol around Wake Island, effectively sealing off any possibility of United States Navy reinforcement or resupply. This deep blockade ensured that the already isolated garrison became completely cut off, facing an inevitable war of attrition. The knowledge that no help was coming, combined with the relentless bombing and the constant threat of a renewed invasion, placed immense psychological pressure on both the United States Marine Corps and the civilian contractors, pushing them to the absolute limits of human endurance. In desperation, the United States Navy attempted a rescue and relief mission, codenamed Task Force 14. This task force, which included the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, was dispatched with the intention of resupplying the besieged island and providing air cover. However, due to delays, logistical challenges, and the perceived overwhelming strength of the reinforced Japanese Imperial Navy forces that were now approaching Wake Island, Task Force 14 was controversially recalled. This heartbreaking decision, made to protect the valuable aircraft carrier, sealed the fate of the brave defenders, leaving them to face the inevitable second, decisive Japanese invasion alone. The humiliating failure of the first Japanese Imperial Army naval assault on Wake Island infuriated the Japanese high command. They immediately recognized that a mere air bombardment would not be enough to break the defiant United States Marine Corps garrison. To ensure the rapid capture of the strategic atoll, the Japanese Imperial Navy dispatched a significantly reinforced invasion fleet. This second force included 2 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 2 aircraft carriers, along with a substantially larger landing force of elite special naval landing forces, transforming the initial defeat into a massive, overwhelming commitment. This second invasion force was commanded by Vice Admiral Shigematsuhara, who was determined to crush the resistance and restore Japanese Imperial Navy prestige. The sheer scale of the new force was designed to overwhelm the small, isolated United States Marine Corps garrison. The approach of such a powerful fleet, now including aircraft carriers, meant that the Japanese would have absolute air superiority from the very beginning of the assault, eliminating the last remaining threat from the few Marine Corps fighter planes and ensuring that the land-based defenders would be completely exposed. On the night of December 22, 1941, the massive Japanese Imperial Navy invasion force began its final assault on Wake Island. Under the cover of darkness, the transports moved into position, and the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces began their amphibious landings. The United States Marine Corps defenders, despite their exhausted state and knowledge of the overwhelming odds, were ready. They manned their coastal guns and machine gun nests, determined to inflict maximum casualties on the invaders and make them pay a heavy price for every inch of the atoll. The battle immediately turned into a brutal, close-quarters slugfest. The Japanese landing forces, highly trained and well-equipped, surged onto the beaches under heavy fire. The United States Marine Corps defenders, from their carefully prepared positions, fought with desperate courage. However, the sheer numerical superiority of the invaders, combined with continuous naval bombardment and relentless air support, meant that the battle was a struggle against an unstoppable tide. The heroic resistance was fierce, but the ultimate outcome was now tragically inevitable. The Second Japanese Imperial Army invasion of Wake Island was relentless and overwhelming. Unlike the first failed attempt, the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces swiftly established multiple beachheads, pouring thousands of elite troops onto the tiny atoll. The United States Marine Corps defenders, despite their tenacity, were stretched thin across the islands, fighting desperately against an unstoppable tide. The battle quickly fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance, as the Japanese forces systematically overwhelmed one defensive position after another, using their superior numbers and heavy supporting fire. The fighting was characterized by brutal, close-quarters combat. United States Marine Corps machine gunners and riflemen fought to the last bullet, often engaging Japanese infantry in hand-to-hand combat amidst the palm trees and shattered bunkers. The civilian contractors, who had bravely assisted throughout the siege, found themselves directly on the front lines, many taking up arms alongside the Marines to defend their positions. Every foot of ground was contested fiercely, turning the tranquil island into a bloody testament to desperate heroism and unyielding defiance. Despite their overwhelming numerical superiority, the Japanese Imperial Army still suffered significant casualties. The United States Marine Corps anti-aircraft guns, repurposed for ground combat, fired directly into the advancing Japanese columns, causing devastating losses. The defenders utilized every available weapon, from grenades to fixed bayonets, creating a murderous gauntlet for the invaders. This fierce resistance, though ultimately futile, deeply impressed the Japanese commanders, who noted the extraordinary bravery and determination of the small, isolated garrison. However, the outcome was tragically predetermined. By the morning of December 23, 1941, after nearly 15 hours of continuous, brutal fighting, the United States Marine Corps Command recognized that further resistance would only lead to the senseless slaughter of their remaining forces. Out of ammunition, heavily outnumbered, and with no hope of relief, Major James Devereux reluctantly ordered the garrison to surrender. The last message sent from Wake Island before its fall encapsulated their valiant struggle. "Enemy landing! The issue is in doubt." This surrender marked the end of one of the most heroic and defiant last stands in the early days of the Pacific War. The moment the surrender order was given on December 23, 1941, the heroic defense of Wake Island ended, and a new, brutal chapter began for the surviving defenders. The Japanese Imperial Army immediately secured the atoll, rounding up the exhausted United States Marine Corps and the civilian contractors. The stark reality set in. The approximately 450 Marines and over 1,100 civilians were now prisoners of war, POWs, facing an uncertain and terrifying future under harsh wartime conditions. The Japanese forces, although victorious, were deeply angered and humiliated by the heavy losses inflicted by the small garrison. The first move by the Japanese Imperial Army was to systematically separate the prisoners. The military personnel, including Major James Devereux and his Marine Corps command, were quickly segregated from the civilian contractors. The Japanese command viewed the military prisoners as a priority target for removal. They were soon evacuated from Wake Island and transported to various prisoner of war camps in Asia, primarily to camps in China and later Japan, marking the end of the Marines' active involvement on the island. The fate of the vast number of civilian contractors was different and more immediately precarious. The Japanese Imperial Army retained the majority of the civilian workers on Wake Island. These men, mostly employees of the Morrison-Knudsen Company, were immediately put to work as forced laborers. They were compelled to rebuild the very defenses and the naval air base they had just been constructing for the United States Navy, now under the relentless supervision of the Japanese captors. Their technical skills were highly valued by the Japanese for their own war effort. The initial period of captivity for all the prisoners, both the Marines transported to Asia and the civilians left on Wake Island, was characterized by severe hardship. The prisoners immediately faced starvation, endemic disease, and the brutal, often arbitrary cruelty of their Japanese guards. The years that followed would be marked by immense suffering, pushing the endurance of the captured soldiers and civilians to unimaginable limits, underscoring the tragic cost of the valiant, isolated defense. For the over 1,100 civilian contractors left on Wake Island after the United States Marine Corps surrender, the brutal realities of Japanese captivity quickly became their daily existence. These men, originally skilled engineers, technicians, and construction workers, were immediately pressed into forced labor by the Japanese Imperial Army. They were compelled to complete the very airfield and naval facilities they had been building for the United States Navy, now repurposed for the Japanese war effort. Under constant threat and violence, they rebuilt damaged infrastructure, expanded runways, and constructed new fortifications for their captors, directly contributing to the enemy's logistical strength in the Pacific Ocean. Life as a forced laborer on Wake Island was a nightmare of starvation, disease, and relentless physical abuse. The Japanese guards enforced a brutal regime, often resorting to beatings and summary executions for minor infractions. Food rations were minimal, consisting mainly of rice and inadequate amounts of other sustenance, leading to widespread malnutrition and starvation-related illnesses. Basic sanitation and medical care were virtually non-existent, making dysentery, malaria, and other tropical diseases rampant among the exhausted civilian prisoners, further weakening their already fragile bodies. The psychological torment of these civilian prisoners was immense. They were isolated from the world, with no news of their families or the progress of the war. They endured the constant humiliation of their captors and the grim knowledge that they were effectively helping the enemy. Despite these horrific conditions, acts of quiet defiance and solidarity among the prisoners were common. They would subtly sabotage equipment, slow down work whenever possible, and share meager resources, maintaining a fragile sense of resistance and humanity in the face of brutal oppression. However, the darkest chapter of the civilian ordeal on Wake Island came in October 1943. Fearing an imminent United States Navy invasion and wishing to prevent the prisoners from assisting their liberators, the Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakaibara, ordered the execution of the remaining 98 American civilian prisoners. These unarmed men were brutally blindfolded, taken to the northern end of the island, and machine-gunned in cold blood. Only one prisoner escaped the initial fusillade, attempting to carve 98 POWs into a rock before being recaptured and personally beheaded by Sakibara, a monstrous act that later ensured his own trial and execution for war crimes. The massacre of the 98 American civilian prisoners on Wake Island in October 1943 remained a dark secret until the war's end. Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakibara, the Japanese commander who ordered the executions, attempted to conceal the atrocity by forcing surviving prisoners to sign false statements. However, after the Japanese surrender in 1945, the full truth emerged. Sakibara was subsequently arrested, tried by a United States military tribunal as a war criminal, found guilty of his monstrous acts, and executed by hanging in June 1947, bringing a grim but necessary justice to the victims. The long ordeal of the United States Marine Corps prisoners of war, who had been transported to camps in China and Japan, also concluded with the end of World War II. They endured nearly 4 years of brutal captivity, facing starvation, forced labor, torture, and endemic disease. Many perished, but the survivors were finally liberated in August 1945. These brave men, though scarred by their experiences, returned home to tell their stories, ensuring that the heroism of Wake Island and the suffering of the POWs would never be forgotten. The defense of Wake Island, despite its ultimate military failure, stands as one of the most significant and inspiring acts of defiance in the early days of World War II. The courage of the small United States Marine Corps garrison and the civilian contractors, who repelled the first Japanese Imperial Navy invasion and inflicted heavy losses on a vastly superior force, served as a crucial morale booster for the Allied nations immediately after Pearl Harbor. It became a powerful symbol of American tenacity and the willingness to fight to the last man, earning it the evocative nickname the Alamo of the Pacific. Today, Wake Island remains a quiet, uninhabited territory of the United States, a solemn testament to the sacrifice and valor displayed in December 1941. The names of the Marines and the massacred civilians are etched into memorials, ensuring their stories endure. The legacy of Wake Island serves as a stark reminder of the immense human cost of war and the extraordinary courage of those who choose to defy overwhelming odds, even when facing certain defeat.